Let me tell you, it's pretty hard to overstate the power of a federal prosecutor in the American justice system. I mean, they have the power to take away a person's liberty, and there are very few effective checks on that power. But what happens when that power gets so concentrated that it creates a paradox? When the very system designed to find the truth ends up arguing that two completely opposite things are both true. Today, we're diving into what a major law review calls the most significant design flaw in federal prosecution, how one person can end up acting as investigator, advocate, and judge all at the same time.
So, let's just start with a really simple question. Can the U.S. government, in a court of law, argue that two completely opposite things are both true? It sounds impossible, right? But stick with me, because this sets the stage for a case that reveals everything about what we're calling the prosecutor's paradox.
So here's the deal with Keon Paler. Back in 2014, the Department of Justice presented its first version of the truth. Paler illegally hid a gun on his porch. He pleaded guilty. He was sent to prison. But then, plot twist. Later on, when prosecuting a corrupt police detective, the very same DOJ presented a second, totally contradictory truth, that the detective was part of a crew that framed people and that Paler was actually a victim who had that same exact gun planted on him. You can just imagine the scene when Paler's case reached the appeals court. Federal Judge Stephanie Thacker was just baffled by what the government was doing. She looked right at the prosecutor and asked, "Which is the truth? Does the government not share at least my concern that the government has talked out of both sides of its mouth on this case?" Right there in open court, a federal judge was calling out a system that was completely at odds with itself.
So how on earth does something like this happen? How can a justice system produce two totally competing truths? Well, the answer isn't just about one messy case. Nope, it's about the fundamental structure of the prosecutor's role, where a single person effectively wears three different hats: investigator, advocate, and judge.
Okay, to really get this, we have to talk about something called adjudicative power. It sounds technical, but it's simple. Think of it as the power to be the referee, the umpire, the judge. It's the authority to make the final call on a case, to decide guilt and punishment. And in a system built on checks and balances, that power is supposed to belong to a neutral party, like a judge or a jury, not the same people who are building the case.
And look, this isn't just some fringe idea I'm throwing out there. A really important article in the Stanford Law Review argues that combining law enforcement with this adjudicative power in one person isn't just a small problem. They call it the most significant design flaw in the federal criminal system. That's a huge statement. Because when the person building the case is also the one effectively judging it, the risk of bias just goes through the roof. So what does this combination of powers actually look like in practice? Well, let's break it down. The prosecutor is the one who investigates the case, gathering evidence. Then they get to decide what criminal charges to file, which is a massive decision. In court, they become the government's advocate, arguing to win. But here's the big one. They control the plea bargains. And that, right there, is where they get to decide the final outcome.
And that brings us right to the main arena where this power gets used, the plea bargain. We all have this image of justice happening in a big courtroom with a jury. But in the federal system, that's actually pretty rare. For most people, the real judging happens behind closed doors in the prosecutor's office. Just look at these numbers. They're staggering. A full 95% of all federal convictions come from guilty pleas, not trials. Let that sink in. That means in the vast, vast majority of cases, the prosecutor's decision on what kind of plea deal to offer is, for all practical purposes, the final judgment.
So you might be asking, why do so many people just plead guilty? Why not take your chances and fight it in court? Well, a huge reason is something that legal experts call the trial penalty. It's the cold, hard fact that if you dare to exercise your right to a trial and you lose, you are going to face a much, much harsher sentence than if you had just taken the plea deal. And we're not talking about a small difference here. It's huge. According to the research, federal defendants who go to trial get sentences, on average, 3 times longer than those who just plead guilty. Think about that. That's an unbelievable amount of leverage that gives prosecutors the power to secure a plea. This system creates this really powerful and frankly pretty troubling incentive. As the late Harvard law professor William Stuntz pointed out, prosecutors are encouraged to threaten charges that are excessive even by their own standards. Basically, the system rewards prosecutors for throwing the book at someone so that the deal they offer looks like a great escape, even if it's still a really harsh sentence. Okay, so if putting all this power in one place is the problem, is there a fix? Is there a better way to do this? Well, that Stanford Law Review article suggests we should look to a pretty surprising place for an answer:
the world of administrative agencies. You know, places like the FTC or the SEC. Turns out, they've been dealing with this exact same problem for decades. And the solution they use is a principle called internal separation of functions. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually super simple. You basically build a wall inside the agency. The team that investigates and argues the case is kept completely separate from the staff who make the final judge-like decisions. It insulates that final judgment from the natural will to win that every advocate has.
So what would this actually look like in a prosecutor's office? Well, let's walk through it. First, one assistant U.S. attorney, the investigator, handles the case and gathers facts. Then, and this is the key part, that case file gets handed over to a totally different, neutral AUSA who acts as the adjudicator. They weren't part of the investigation, and they make the big decisions on charges and pleas. And if the case still goes to trial, a third AUSA steps in to be the advocate in court.
So, what's the payoff for doing all this? Well, the benefits are pretty clear. This model puts checks and balances inside the prosecutor's office itself. It helps reduce that win-at-all-costs bias that an investigator can develop, and it helps make sure the final call is based on the actual facts of the case, not just an advocate's desire for a conviction.
Look, this isn't just about moving boxes around on an org chart. It's about changing the entire goal of the prosecutor's office, reorienting it back to what it's supposed to be about in the first place, a genuine search for the truth.
And that takes us right back where we started, to Judge Thacker and that crazy Keon Paler case. After listening to the government argue two opposite realities, she reminded them of something fundamental. She said there cannot be two sides to the truth. The truth is the truth. Our justice system should be designed to find that one truth.
Which really leaves us with one last question to think about. When our system allows a single person to investigate a case, advocate for a conviction, and then ultimately judge the outcome, can we honestly call that a search for truth? Or is it something else entirely?